Okay, you're probably wondering why I'm so close. It's because my throat's still giving me some significant issues right now, and so being closer to the mic like this makes it so I don't have to project as much, which is actually very helpful for me in, keeping my throat safe and decent, especially since I have to record about 5 episodes in the next 2 days, so yeah. Let's talk about this episode in historical context. There's two ways it's interesting historically. Number one, and the most obvious, this episode came out right about the point in time at which First Contact had come out as a movie. Now, First Contact is often considered to be, the one truly good TNG movie. But which, I mean, I'm not saying the others are necessarily bad, as a lot of people disagree on that, both positively and negatively, but most people agree First Contact was good, and it certainly sold very well. So there was a lot of pressure from people who weren't actually the creators or even the producers of Star Trek in order to kind of do something like that. So they took one of the existing scripts that had already been worked on by, by Brannon Braga, and kind of modified it to give it a little bit more of an actiony tint than was originally intended. That brings me to my second point. In historical context, in real life, a game just came out from my perspective called Alien Isolation, and it looks like it's actually a pretty decent game horror-wise. Looks like a properly decent horror survivalist, whatever you want to call that game, and yeah. But it's funny going from that, which is genuinely properly creepy and paranoid and whatnot, to this. In fact, to put this in a little bit of context, while I was watching the episode, I also had another thing up where I was watching some Alien Isolation gameplay, so I literally went from one to the other within the space of a few minutes, which was kind of an interesting contrast. But anyways, let's move on. This is going to be a little bit of a truncated episode, so I do apologize. I just don't have that much to talk about, and there's that whole throat issue I just mentioned. So, our good friends, the Tac Tac. Now, most people I know who like Voyager agree that the Tac Tac are dumb. But the interesting thing is, as with so much of Voyager, the Tac Tac represent so much of a possibility of what could have been, I feel. Think about we and human beings in real life who communicate, right? This is something that's always been fascinating to me personally. I've even talked about this on the show several times. The idea of the fact that we don't just use the words we speak, but the tone with which we speak, the method by which we speak, the pacing and whatnot, the inflection that we put on the words as we're talking, so tone, pacing, inflection, and all of that is just the verbal side of things. Then we get into body language, which itself really should be divvied up into several different categories, because you have facial body language, which you change the expression you have or the way you're actually talking in order to try and get across a different emphasis in what you're trying to communicate. And then there's, of course, body language in terms of what you're doing motion-wise while you're talking, like I'm doing right now. I don't even know if you can see this on the camera, but you get the general idea. And then there's the harder to define concept of body language, which is usually the only thing I actually refer to as body language, because it's the thing that most people aren't doing consciously. Speaking as someone who has studied communication extensively, and as I've mentioned before, I actually study the way other people move, walk, talk, etc. And I'm usually really, really good at telling what a person's intended meaning is based almost solely on their body language when they're saying whatever it is they're saying. Half the time, what the words coming out of their mouth don't actually matter for all intents and purposes. So I mention all of this because the Tac Tac were a fascinating thing to me, because they're basically another version of the L Corps from Mass Effect. Although the Tac Tac would have been first in that case. But think about it like this. Imagine if the Tac Tac had communicated through body language, through posture and tone and all that fun stuff, right? Now, I know what you're probably saying. They did, Arsh. No. if you pay attention, if you listen, he was still doing all of the other forms of communication a human being would do. He was still actually acting, and I am sure that was actually intended and directed. But think about the possibility of someone... Let me try and do this. This is actually hard to do. Someone who is speaking without tone or inflection, and at the same pace, regardless of information being conveyed. You know, kind of the Elcor thing, right? But the Elcor communicated through their scent glands, or whatever the hell it was. What would that be? Olfactory. There we go. But the Tac-Tac do it through body language. So imagine, as I'm talking in a very simple tone, I am explaining to you through my body language. Imagine a species that has that culturally, societally. You know, this isn't really an evolution thing, because that's not what body language is. Body language is, I mean, it is an evolution thing, but my point is it's not physiological, it's not biological, it's not an imperative. It's instead something that happens because of a society or culture. So imagine a whole society or culture that grew around the idea of communicating solely through body language, with words tacked on basically just because they have to do it in order to communicate with other species. Kind of like the Elcor again. I just think that would be a really cool idea, and really would have made the Tac-Tac more interesting. Especially given one other point. This is skipping ahead in the episode, forgive me, but it's hard to deny the fact that the Tac-Tac are... well, let's just say that there's two different ways to interpret what they do in this episode. What we know is they detected the infection in the mining colony and killed all of those miners, purged it, as they themselves said, and were willing to do the same with Voyager. I mention this because this is a deliberate subtlety on the part of Brown and Braga, and it's something that most people skip right over, and that's the point. That's the point of a subtlety. Most people shouldn't notice it on first viewing. But he just casually mentions, oh, by the way, I just massacred a whole bunch of miners in a mine. Except he doesn't say it like that. He just says, we have purified the mine, and now we purify you. And of course, the episode immediately focuses on the purifying you part rather than the, oh my god, you just killed tons of people part. And I find that absolutely fascinating, because there's only two ways to interpret that, generally speaking, from my opinion. One, the Tac-Tac have experience with this virus in the past. Now, this has several implications. Number one, this virus has to be, in some form or another, a virus that has already had the macroism effect happen to it. That it actually can already grow, right? So... therefore, they already know what kind of situation can arise and how quickly this thing can spread. And so they, as a policy, have gotten to the point where they're basically acting like the Protoss and just use fire as the solution. You could interpret that maybe they regret it. Maybe they are, they don't like the fact that they have to purify these areas and these people, but they feel like they have no choice because otherwise the infection is a huge danger to the entire sector, etc. Or one could also assume, although this is even stupider, but whatever, the fact that the virus has always been just a normal virus and just spreads like wildfire, but in the case of it infecting those miners, it somehow grew. Yes, I know they try to explain it in the episode, but growth hormones do not make a virus grow by a factor of billions in the space of hours. I'm sorry. Anyways, point being, the idea that the virus had just been spreading, more like a virus until it got to the point where it found these miners and started getting big, which could also interpret the fact that they didn't have to purify these people normally. Maybe they would allow them to be their own means or just kind of quarantine them, but because they saw how out of control it was getting now because of the macro aspect of the virus, maybe they have to purify them, etc., etc. Second way to interpret this, though, and this one's more interesting to me, is the Tac-Tac have never encountered this virus before, but they still chose to purify a colony that was infected because they found the distress signal and probably were able to determine, we have this secret infection. And the Tac-Tac were like, you're infected. We have a cure for that. And then burned them all alive. Both of these overall interpretations speak volumes of the Tac-Tac as a society. At the very least when it comes to external affairs or military affairs, which is really what this purview would list under. And I'm not sure which interpretation I prefer, but both, I almost wish both were explored a little bit more, but again, that would defeat the point of the subtlety. It's just very well done in the fact that it's like, by the way, we have no problem doing this, or by the way, we feel like this is the only possible solution, etc. It's the same kind of reason why I tend to find the Protoss fascinating from a cultural perspective. Or to phrase this more literally, I'm sorry that I have to kill you, but I have to kill you. Let's move on. Another interesting thing about this episode, the previous episode, and the next episode were all basically being filmed side by side. A lot of side-by-side work, and there was a lot of behind-the-scenes production issues with all three. I've already mentioned some of those in Q and the Gray. There were some in this episode, quite a few actually, and some issues as well in the next episode, the one that's upcoming here, Fair Trade. I just mentioned it, though, because the three scripts actually reference each other pretty tightly as a result of this. It's all very minor stuff, but for example, Fair Trade directly references this episode, whose name I get, Macrocosm, and Macrocosm actually has a hint of the next episode. In a way that you wouldn't even notice. It's Neelix's little A Day with Neelix briefing. If you can hear him and pay attention to the Day with Neelix briefing, he actually talks about stuff that will happen or has happened during Fair Trade. Nice little continuity thing. The reason I bring it up, though, is the whole fact that Neelix basically was just appointed, or at least is about to be appointed, a official or unofficial ambassador for Voyager. And then the events of Fair Trade happened, but we'll talk about that in that episode. So, for those of you who don't know, the Tac were actually inspired by, of all things, Kate Mulgrew. Kate Mulgrew, when she's acting, has a tendency to put her hands on her hips and strike a very specific form of body language. I can describe it to you, but just watch her do it sometime. You'll see the muscles and the bones kind of shift in just a little bit to the point where she's obviously making a pose when she does it, which is another one of those subtle little things that human beings do in general without realizing it most of the time when it comes to body language. Actors do this a lot, too. And I just mentioned that because it's funny to me, because then the Tac then later inspired the Cretaceans in Enterprise. So this episode was done by Brannon Braga, as I mentioned. He's also the gentleman who gave us Genesis back in TNG. Not what I would call a good episode. Not a bad episode. Just not really one of my favorites. It kind of indicative of season 7. They did some interesting stuff, and then they did some weird stuff, and then they did some bad stuff, because they were kind of running out of ideas. But the reason I mentioned the Genesis connection specifically is because back when Braga did that, he was still a fairly new writer, all things considered. And it hadn't occurred to him that it would actually create greater dramatic tension to do a situation structurally where here's the crew, part of the crew leaves, the camera follows this crew, and then we come back, and you'll notice this crew is now gone. And now we have to figure out the mystery while the characters do. Now, if you remember, Genesis did the total opposite of that. This crew went off, and the camera stayed here, and we saw things go to hell over a period of time, and so there was no mystery and no real suspense about what was going on because we knew we'd already seen it. Then we cut to these guys, and there's some rehashing as they start to learn what happened, etc., etc. And that sounds like an obvious mistake, but in all honesty, it isn't. It is very common, especially in television, to want to show the audience what's going on, to not want to try to keep secrets from them or hide things from them. I know that sounds weird, but it is very true, especially in the era of television in which Star Trek was still coming out, back in what I generally refer to as the 90s era of television. That was pretty much the norm. Now, by this episode, he had enough pull and was actually a staff writer, indeed pretty much one of the main writers of Voyager, to the point where he could do it differently, and of course he had grown a bit as a writer. So he did it properly in this episode, and honestly, I find myself wondering if Genesis would have been a better episode if it had been structured like this. Because this time we go off, then we come back, and we have no idea what the hell went on, and the entire first act is the suspense mystery. And I know this sounds weird, but honestly, I felt like the first act was actually properly tense. Not to the extent of, Alien Isolation, like I just mentioned, or indeed other works I can mention, The Thing. But for Star Trek, yeah, it was actually pretty suspenseful, and I actually really liked the atmosphere. So some good job on the directing and the music and sound direction, and of course the overall script composition. Now, I've kind of been praising this episode, but I gotta mention something that's just terrible. Voyager fell in a day. A day. I could really rip this apart. I'm going to not, because it's a negative thing, and I don't really feel like straining my throat because I might end up yelling. But suffice it to say that even though there's some good stuff in this, for example, Chakotay gets to actually act like a commander. Again, that's 2 in a row. Wow. But he actually gets to act like a proper commander, and it actually has some good scenes in this episode when he's interacting with the Doctor. And you know what? I'm just going to segue for a moment because I want to mention this. I like the Chakotay we see in this episode, and I wish we saw more of him. He strikes me, and I don't mean this as a negative comparison, he strikes me as kind of the William Riker form of commander. In other words, he is a military-minded individual, first season notwithstanding. He does know how to be strict, he knows how to be hard, and he usually is, but at the same point in time, he actually has that paternal, fatherly aspect to him, to the point where he actually cares about his crew, and this is important, he demonstrates that regularly. We see in this episode that kind of Chakotay, that kind of commander. The Chakotay who is puts his foot down and says, no, this, that, orders. But when the crisis has passed, comes aside and explains to him, you did good. You did good, son. And actually has that more human touch to it. This is ironic because I've been going through the Metal Gear Solid series, but to put it bluntly, whereas Jellicoe, if you even know who that is, was more of a soldier, Riker and indeed Chakotay in this episode are more of a person who know how to act like a soldier when the circumstance requires it, or I should say act like an officer, to be more accurate. But as I was saying, the whole situation where the ship gets infected and falls apart and the ship is self-destructing basically in a day. This is the kind of thing a writer will do often. They'll demonstrate how quickly and how severely things can go bad to emphasize the threat. And that can work if you think about it more. And I mean no disrespect to Braga, but he is not, actually thinking things out literally and linearly is not his strong suit. It never has been as a writer. By contrast, he tends to do things that are just more don't think about it, or more cerebral, or more metaphoric. He tends to do that kind of stuff pretty well. Most people refer to those as mind game type episodes. But his approach here was to try and exemplify how dangerous this virus is. But the problem is there's so much technology and so many means by which these people have to prevent this virus from ever having become an outbreak, that it's actually just kind of silly that it actually managed to outbreak. For example, we have found, I forget what they're actually called. I just watched this episode. The biofilters. The biofilters have found a virus in them. Naturally, there's no such thing as to actually purge the biofilters, nor is there some kind of sealant on the biofilters, because that would just be silly, even though we actually know that both of those things are true, not just from Voyager, but also from TNG. And then you have to go and manually purge the biofilters, which is what allows the virus a chance to escape. No. That's all I'm saying. Let's talk about... The CGI in this episode is worth talking about. This is actually kind of another Hallmark episode in its own weird way, because this is the first time we've seen a truly 100%, well, 90% CGI creature. When I say 100% CGI, those of you who don't know, CGI, in general, in movies and television both, when you have a creature that is 100% CGI, in other words, fully generous CGI, the Land Eel is another good example of this back in Basics, you don't actually... That's not actually true. There is almost always something physically there that the actors can interact with or look at or, whatever. And then they touch it. It also helps to add shadows to a scene. That's another excellent reason to do that. And then they touch it up later and superimpose CGI on top of that. What I'm trying to say here is that traditional effects have much more to do with CGI effects than most people seem to think. The usual exception is when there's a scene that is literally 100% CGI, so everything is CGI. And of course, there's some scenes where they take it to a bit too much of an extreme, where there's a person sitting on a green chair in a green room with a green wall and a green ceiling. That has been done, and it's dumb. And most people agree that that doesn't work as well, but I'm getting off topic. The point is, the Land Eel was their first real foray into this kind of a thing, but this is the first time they've actually had a major alien species be fully CGI and interact with the crew on a regular basis, aka throughout most of the episode. And it's funny because the producers and the writers and all the people behind it, when they saw the visual effects, were like, "This is awesome." I mentioned that because the CGI people, the actual, the Babylon 5 team I've mentioned earlier, whose name I can't think of right now, forgive me, thought it was crap. They thought they did terribly. They were very disappointed by the job done on the CGI in this episode. I'll let you make up your own mind. I actually thought it was pretty good, on all honesty. Even though it is obviously CGI, for the time and for the television, it not only is more than acceptable, but honestly, it never actually broke the scenes for me personally. Probably the only one that actually caught me was when Ricardo was wrestling with one of the things. That's basically it. Otherwise, very well done job on the effect of the CGI team. But I also mentioned that because I've been mentioning production problems with this trio of episodes. Part of that is the editing and the CGI effects for this episode and the next episode went way over budget and over time, and so they were actually running behind a bit. And that's one of the reasons why several of the effects in this episode were actually recycled in the next episode, in case anyone was wondering. Green Flame being a good example of this. Tell me someone gets the reference. So, let's go ahead and talk about the reason why this episode actually interests me. This episode began as two separate scripts. Now, that's not uncommon. For those of you not aware, at least this is how it worked in Star Trek era. People would sell scripts to the studio, basically, and the studio would hold on to them and have, rights to use them whenever and to edit them however they please, basically. And then they need an episode of blah, so they'll look at their scripts and they'll either take one or take several and combine them into what is known as a teleplay. This is why half the time you'll see a different story credit, a different writer credit, and then a different teleplay credit, because sometimes all three are completely separate people, and that just works like that sometimes. Q in the Gray, I think was a good example of that. But a better example of that is the 7 episode, much, much later. I think it's in Season 5. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. Point I'm reaching here is that the two scripts were one by Brown and Braga, which I'll talk about more extensively in a moment, but that's basically what I like to call the Act 1 script, and 2, the Doctor's First Away mission script. Now, the reason the Doctor's First Away mission script didn't actually get turned into its own episode, even though that was the original intent, was it was believed there was not enough content to really flesh it out into an entire episode. Whether that's true or not is up to debate, but you can really feel the divergence between the two scripts when you look at it that way. And in fact, if you look at the entire episode structurally, you can see why the episode doesn't quite work logically, because the entire point was the Act 2 script was all about the Doctor actually being down there on the people, actually interacting with the people, learning about what it's like to see the suffering of other people who he's never met before firsthand and dealing with that emotionally, trying to help them, being stopped because he couldn't actually bring things from the ship back down, getting stranded there himself, basically an away mission gone wrong. A fairly typical type of episode, and indeed TNG and to an extent the original series have also done that episode concept. But since it was literally the Doctor's first time doing that, there's enough of a fresh twist on it, and Ricardo's enough of a good actor that it probably would have worked. The way it was merged with the virus episode was the growth thing, which is one of the reasons I mentioned the growth thing is kind of ridiculous. It was literally done as a method by which to combine the two episodes together. Because the first episode was always going to be about an alien creature that had invaded, which was, normal sized. And the Doctor episode was always going to be about him dealing with an outbreak. So, how do we merge these two together? I've got it, let's just make our virus grow! Insert Power Rangers joke here. So that's one of the reasons why that kind of feels like two different episodes, if you ever really structurally analyzed this episode. Now, that being said, obviously that sounds like a derogatory, but that being said, I have to give this episode credit because the two stories actually gel fairly well, all things considered. Other than the logical hiccups and the stupidity of the virus thing, it actually feels more cohesive than it should. The only really weak part is the third act, which is all basically the action-adventure part of let's go ahead and deal with these varmints, which was originally mostly part of Act 1, and just kind of had the Doctor slid in there. And that's one of the reasons why the Doctor basically doesn't actually do anything in Act 3 and is just defeated at every turn, because Act 3 was never supposed to include him, if you understand. Let's talk about one other thing before we talk about the final point. That's the holodeck scene, if you know what I'm talking about in this episode. If you don't, there's a scene where, in order to the holographic emissions leave off certain types of blah, 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 that the viruses also determine are similar to human beings. which again makes a little bit more sense if they were an alien invading force rather than viruses, but I'm getting off topic. Point being, so she turns on the holodeck as a distraction. She turns on the resort program specifically, which has appeared in several episodes and will appear in several scenes. And I don't know how to explain this, but in the middle, this is actually one of the few times I feel like Trek has done comedy very well, because it's this big tense scene and there's this dramatic music, and then there's just a jump cut in here, lighthearted kind of Caribbean party music, and all these people just going walking around in bathing suits, enjoying the resort, and then you see these aliens just invade, and everyone's like, oh my god, light music still playing, It was actually really funny. And I felt like it was actually a really good touch. Kind of makes you wonder why they didn't do that earlier, but, whatever. Moving on. Let's talk about the original point of the first script, though. Braga's script. This deserves to be talked about, because I personally would have really enjoyed it if the first script had seen its original intent. Here's the thing. Brannon Braga likes to experiment in his writing. He likes to stretch out and grow. And that's not really surprising, most writers do. And having seen some of the work he has done since Star Trek, it looks like he actually did get a chance to get out there and do stuff that wasn't just mashing out tons and tons and tons of episodes over and over. So props to him. Honestly, if they ever went back and we actually got a new Star Trek show, at this point in time, honestly, I'd probably go ahead and recommend Braga to be one of the staff writers. And he himself has said he'd love to be. So has Michael Piller, who was another writer who got to do some good things after Star Trek. So, hell yeah. But my reason for bringing this up is he really wanted to stretch and do a different kind of episode, not just from a writing perspective, but from an overall presentation. And I think it would have worked great. He wanted to do an episode with virtually no dialogue. He wanted to do an entire episode where body language and music and scene and camera choice would have shown shown the story rather than it all being spoken out loud. And you kind of see how the tac actually tie into this whole thing with the whole body language idea now, huh? Because the idea was originally going to be, here's the tac at the beginning, and then that whole situation, and then Neelix, is attacked, and then there's going to be a nice big chunk of, just her fighting the alien intruders, and no dialogue in this entire section. Grunts, sounds, careful directing work, careful camera work, and then it was going to be bookended with the tac and Neelix as well. It still would have worked with the combined episode, too. Think about it this way. We start off with the tac, we have the thing where Neelix gets attacked, big old chunk of silence until Janeway meets the Doctor. And if you're paying attention, there is a big old chunk of silence before the Janeway meets the Doctor. There's like no dialogue for that entire section. And honestly, that's the section I mentioned that I felt had actual good tension. Granted, this is opinion. But then we have the Doctor, and then he has his little explanation. Probably truncate the explanation scene, the exposition scene down a bit. Leave him behind, and then go back to the silence of her going out and trying to deal with this threat, and then it's defeated, and then we bookend it with the Doctor, her, Neelix, and of course the tac. I feel like that could have worked personally. Maybe that's just my opinion. But I mention it especially because I feel so bad for Braga. Of all the shows to be on, the one show that is most known for the reset button and the status quo is the show where he wanted to experiment and reach out as a writer to do new things. I mean, come on, Oh, excuse me. Anyway, I haven't been sleeping lately. That's it for now. We're going to go ahead and I'm just going to start up the next episode right now because I got a billion videos to do today. But I'll be seeing you in a few hours, and you'll be seeing me in a few weeks. See you next time.